So Marc, tell us, what's your unlawful moment?
I believe my unlawful moment has been my entire career. If you had told me 55 years ago, growing up in New Jersey as a Jewish working class kid, the first one of my family to go to college, that you'd end up your career working for an international law firm, having taught in a law school for 20 years, I would have looked at you askance.
This is Unlawful. Welcome to Unlawful. As always, I'm Brandon Renken, and with me today is Marc Kadish. Marc Kadish is actually a lawyer at Mayer Brown, where I work, and it's funny because every time I start trying to describe his exact title or his exact position at the law firm, it's a little wrong or a little not interesting enough, so I'm going to let him describe it. Marc, what do you do here at Mayer Brown?
Anything I want, but that's not true. I was a clinical professor at one of the local law schools in Chicago from 1979 to 1999. I was then hired by Mayer Brown to establish their worldwide pro bono program. At that time, I was the second full-time pro bono coordinator in the city and about the 15th in the country. Now, almost 25 years later, it is a growth area in large law firms. So I established and ran the program from June 1, 1999 until the end of 2015, when I, quite frankly, had lost interest in the administrative aspects of the job, wasn't doing that good a job on it, and wanted to turn it over to my assistant, who has now been the head of the pro bono program since the beginning of 2016. Her name is Marc, and she was my assistant for about 10 years or so. The firm said, well, Marc, you are over 70. Don't you want to retire? And I said, no, my wife is much younger than me. She is a lifelong public defender in Cook County. She's now a supervisor of all the bail courts at the major criminal court building. And she said she wasn't retiring. And I said, well, I'm not going to retire either. So the firm said, okay, we're going to cut your office size, cut your pay, but just help out the pro bono program. So they call me pro bono advisor. I do basically no fee generating work whatsoever.
And I want to jump in there and I want to cut into two of the things you said and dig a little deeper. One of the first things you said is you do whatever you want. It's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that I've said over and over on this podcast, Unlawful, and I tell associates and students, is that part of the practice of law is bending the profession to your will a little bit.
Absolutely. But in terms of when I say, sometimes I can be a little flip, shall we say.
Sure.
When I say I can do whatever I want, what that means is if someone contacts me with a very interesting, unusual pro bono case, I will consider taking it. In fact, we won a Honduran case about 6 weeks ago on behalf of a mother and her young daughter who had fled after she had viewed a murder and then had been threatened and beaten by the Mara 18 gang in Honduras. So I worked with two wonderful associates on that, and we won the case. And those kinds of things make my life meaningful. We now have another immigration case, which is pending, where I'm also working with associates. I love working with the younger associates and helping to strategize them and mentor them.
That's actually the second thing that I wanted to jump into. I said there were two things. I think that there's a lot of cynicism, both in society at large and in the legal community. And there's especially a lot of cynicism when you talk about, quotation marks, big law, right? And people think about big law as getting involved in pro bono work to market to clients, or for some, either ultra cynical or slightly cynical secondary motive. But in speaking to you about it, it's very clear to me that your interest in getting involved in pro bono and in coming to a firm like Mayer Brown to promote its pro bono wasn't for some secondary purpose, but rather was due to a firmly held belief that big law firms can have a meaningful impact on the law and on these cases.
To me, justice at times is a felt thing. In other words, sometimes you just sit there and you say, wait, this is unjust. And I always wanted to be on the side of those little people who were getting screwed. And I would love to say, if an associate worked with me on a matter and the client hugged them at the end of that saying, oh, thank you very much, we would be going back to the office and I would say, when's the last time that a CEO of a major corporation hugged you and thanked you for changing their life?
Tell us, what's your unlawful moment?
My one unlawful moment that has stuck out to me is I call how Ronnie Bronsky, a gangbanger, found God. And in the early 70s, I helped work with a group called Rising Up Angry, a Chicago group that worked with street gangs. Unfortunately, Ronnie got caught up in a shooting and he fled. All right. So now let me jump ahead some 30 odd years. And my wife and I were buying bread on a Sunday afternoon at a really great Italian bakery in the city. I saw an acquaintance of mine, a lawyer by the name of Larry Hyman. He says, I got a funny story for you. I said, what's the funny story? He said, I was fishing by myself in Kodiak, Alaska. I'm on a lake by myself. I see another guy. Since it's the two of us, we start talking. He asks me where I'm from. I tell him I'm from Chicago. His next question is, do you know Marc Kadish?
Of course.
It was Ronnie Bronsky. And what had happened was Ronnie had been involved in a shooting. No one was killed, but it was a shooting. He fled and no one heard from him for several years. He then contacted me and said, Marc, I've changed my life around. I'm living in another city. I've now become a street preacher. I want to do right by society. I want to turn myself in and deal with these charges. And we talked and I said, well, he seems sincere about this. This is cool. So I went to the gang crime cops who were involved in it, and I convinced them that Ronnie was sincere, that he wanted to do right by society, he wanted to turn himself in. I eventually convinced them, yeah, he was on the level. We turned him in. The cops helped us so that Ronnie got probation, and it made a big story in the Chicago Tribune. And then about 4 years later, the Tribune writer who had written the story called me and my wife and said, I gave up being a reporter. I'm now a minister at one of the huge churches that have evolved in the Chicago suburbs. And he said, we have invited Ronnie Bronsky to come preach on a Sunday, and we would be honored if you and your wife attended the service. So that's one of the stories which,
wow,
is meaningful to me that
everything that you just said and everything that you were talking about in that one example is just kind of a perfect encapsulation of everything that we're about here at Unlawful. It's law and justice, devoid of ego, devoid of attribution, devoid of allocation of credit, and focusing on really just getting the job done and caring about what we're doing and that it has meaning. I appreciate the legacy that you're going to leave for not only other partners and lawyers at Mayer Brown, but industry-wide. As you said, when you started doing what you ended up doing for the last 15, 25 years, you were one of the few, and now you're one of the many. And I can't help but think that the reason you're one of the many is because of who you are and the energy that you put into it. I very much appreciate your time, and that's Unlawful.